Aperture.
All for joining us tonight. My name is Nicole Chumpong. I'm the assistant editor of Aperture magazine. For those of you who are not familiar with Aperture, it was founded in 1952 by a group of artists, writers, and curators as a common ground for photography. Aperture today is a multi-platform publisher that unites the photography community in print, in person once upon a time, and definitely online. Tonight's program is the final event in our series celebrating the Utopia issue of Aperture magazine. And we are thrilled to have Antwaun Sargent in conversation with artists Shikeith and Naima Green. In Utopia, artists, photographers, and writers envision a world without prisons, document visionary architecture, honor queer space and creativity, and dream of liberty through spiritual self-expression. They show us that utopia is not a far-fetched scheme, but rather a way of reshaping our future. In Antwaun's essay for the issue, he offers us a map to a Black queer utopia, one where the politics of representation take a back seat to an ethics of personal and communal desire. In this piece, Antwaun gathers together artists, including Shikeith and Naima Green, whose work creates spaces of radical freedom for subjects often pursued by violence. As Antwaun writes quite poetically in the essay's final lines, some queer artists dream in images in defiance of the straight imagination. Their eyes desire narratives of longing and pleasure free of trauma with illuminations of relief. Through their pictures, other ways of existing are possible. I think it worth noting that today is the birthday of Audre Lorde, and I think it's such a beautiful symmetry that this conversation on care and pleasure and Black queer futurity is taking place on the birthday of someone who opened up so many lines of thought around those very ideas. We're very grateful to have our three panelists today to pick up those lines of thoughts, including Antwaun Sargent, who is a writer and critic living and working in New York City. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, New Yorker, New York Review of Books, W, Vogue, and other publications. He has contributed to essays in museums and gallery publications on Ed Clark, Micheline Thomas, Arthur Jafa, Deborah Roberts, and Yinka Shonibare, among other artists. Sargent has lectured and participated in public conversations with artists at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Brooklyn Museum, MCA Denver, Art Gallery of Ontario, and Harvard and Yale universities. He has also co-organized a number of exhibitions, including The Way We Live Now at Aperture, Then and Now, Chase Hall and Cameron Welch at Jenkins Johnson Projects, and the traveling exhibition Young, Gifted, and Black. The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion is his first book. Shikeith is an artist and filmmaker based in Pittsburgh. He received an MFA in sculpture from the Yale School of Art and a BA in integrative arts from the Pennsylvania State University. His work investigates the experiences of Black men within and around concepts of psychic space. Shikeith is a recipient of a 2019 Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant, a 2020 Art Matters Foundation grant, and a 2020 to 2021 Leslie Lohman Museum Artist Fellowship. And Naima Green is an artist and educator based in New York. Her work has been featured in numerous exhibitions, including at Fotografiska New York, the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago, Mass MoCA, North Adams, Massachusetts, the International Center of Photography New York, Bronx Museum, and Brick, Brooklyn. Her works are in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art Library and International Center of Photography Library, New York, and the National Gallery of Art, among other institutions. She holds an ICP Bard MFA, an MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a BA from Barnard College. Programming for Aperture Magazine's Utopia issue is presented in partnership with London-based fashion brand J.W. Anderson. Significant support of Aperture Magazine is provided by the Kanakia Foundation and by John Stryker and Slobodan Rangelovich. Further generous support is provided in part by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Aperture Foundation's programs are made possible in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew M. Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. And tonight we are offering viewers a discount on the Utopia issue and on magazine subscriptions. You can find the discount code in the chat. And I would also like to mention that we will be taking audience questions towards the end of the event. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I pass the virtual mic on to Antwaun Sargent and our two artists. Thank you.
Hey, I am going to do sort of run of show. I'm going to sort of do an introduction, and then we're going to be joined by Naima and Shikeith, who are going to sort of spend some time sort of making their concerns known through their sort of photographic practice. I really wanted to start by sort of talking about the article that I wrote for Aperture, a Utopia issue. The editor-in-chief, Michael, called me and asked if I would sort of contribute something to the issue. And I was sort of thinking about the ways in which sort of the contemporary moment sort of around sort of Black artistic production is sort of flattened by conversations of representation. And for me, the argument that sort of happens in the essay sort of looks at the ways in which that, representation, is a concern of many artists, but it's not the only thing that is sort of in the work. And so I was sort of thinking about sort of the sort of utopic impulse found particularly in queer photographic work, and how that sort of really starts sort of in the 20th century and sort of have worked its way through sort of the practices of artists like Shikeith and Naima. And I sort of was thinking about that in relationship to sort of the idea that the late sort of Professor Jose Munoz sort of kind of spells out or argues in Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer futurity. So one of the things that I was sort of taken by is sort of this idea of sort of queerness belonging to the future, as Munoz claims in his sort of in his study of performance and writing and contemporary art, which sort of allows us to see and feel beyond sort of the present, is as Munoz sort of writes, and which had led me to sort of think about sort of Utopia, as this search for safe space, encounter narratives where queer acts longing and urges, fulfill personal and communal yearnings, which is sort of situated in ideas of desire, sort of acts of desire, representations of desire that flourish beyond sort of the confines of sort of the mainstream, beyond whiteness, beyond sort of the present day, beyond sort of reality in a lot of ways. And so I thought about sort of different image makers who were sort of doing that work, sort of historically like Lalash and Harris, and more contemporarily like Shikeith and Naima. And one of the things in sort of the re-editioning of, Munoz's sort of seminal book, in the introduction, some of his former students sort of write, Utopia bears, many positive attributes, right? We often sort of think about it in relationship to sort of, positivity or sort of escapism. But it sort of evolves, or it comes from the Greek for no place or not place, and they write, queer utopia is the impossible performance of the negation of the negation. And I really sort of, in that sort of last sentence, I really see that in sort of the work of sort of the two artists that are joining us tonight. And with that, I will sort of turn it over to Shikeith to sort of talk about his work, his concerns, and where sort of the utopic impulse shows up in his practice. Hey.
How
are you?
I'm going to share my screen. I'm doing really well, trying to hold on. All right.
Yeah, we can totally see it. I'm going to go off the screen while you present. Okay.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Shikeith. I'm an artist based in Pittsburgh, PA, originally from Philly. My work is an exploration of the psychological landscape of Black manhood. I'm really interested in these histories that, in a way, have entangled our senses of self. And today I'm going to show work that is both early and recent, and I'll focus primarily on my photography, starting with the first body of work, which was entitled Somewhere Over the, that I created in 2013. The image that you're looking at right now is a triptych. It's entitled Where Troubles Melt Like Lemon Drops, that I produced in 2013, which was at the sort of wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, where we saw an increase, or a more visible increase, of anti-Black violence. And I had sort of been making fashion photography at that point, and hadn't really settled into making work that felt personal. And so I really wanted to start that journey. And it began in the studio in Philadelphia, where I invited someone, a young man who I had known, up to the studio to create this series of portraiture that would essentially showcase a sort of more human side to Black men, a side that had been under attack, a side that interculturally had become sort of taboo, a sort of lack of emotionality. And so very, very early sort of language around sort of this boundlessness, which I'll get to, or visualizing this boundlessness. And the story behind this photograph, I wanted to uh, create a sort of sequence of this young man crying. And in order to do that, I was going to use a chemical agent to spark these tears. And unfortunately, the chemical agent didn't work. And I was sort of frozen in the moment. This is sort of my first time having sort of interaction with a subject. Like I said, I was primarily doing fashion photography at the time, but it sort of spun me into this moment where I realized the necessity of a sort of transactional care between myself and the sitter. And while the chemical agent didn't work to spark these tears, what happened was we began a conversation. And in that conversation, we sort of exchanged our experiences growing up in Philly, and sort of some of the hardships that we had faced. And in the midst of that conversation, the tears began to flow, and I was able to capture these images. Uh, Diving more into the personal, like I said, I grew up in Philly, and for those who know, are familiar, I grew up in an area called North Philadelphia, which isn't as easy. But you know, it was a place where a lot of where I learned how to survive through my imagination. But growing up and being a young queer boy, there was often a lot of uh, I want to say just bullying, just plainly bullying. And yeah, so this bullying would occur, and I created this image that was referring to a dream that I would have as a result of the sort of psychological impact of the bullying, where I would be on a roof, and all of the men who had in one way or another harmed me would be chasing after me. And at the edge of this roof would be a balloon. And the balloon would sort of just be suspended in the air. And I knew that it was my escape route. But every time I would go to grab for it, I would fall to my death. And so I produced this image sort of years later, um, illustrating that repetitive nightmare, where I sort of used that balloon as a signifier of liberation to sort of carve out this space, this utopic space for me. Um, where I sort of saw sort of dwelling of freedom. To continue, a lot of my previous work was black and white. I think it was sort of just to signify the mood, the emotions that I have been trying to communicate. But later on, in 2018, I wanted to create an image that dealt with my yearnings for intimacy, particularly intimacy with another Black man. And I produced Brush Your Blues. It was produced in my first year at Yale, and I wanted to sort of stretch out that language of the sort of binary of black and white by thinking more about a sort of multidimensionality that occurs within a gradient of grays. And so that beget this work. Um, Later that year, I was still sort of wrestling back and forth with previous ideas and wanting to sort of begin a journey onto some of the ideas that have been, or concepts that have been arising in my sculptural practice. And so in my studio, I would have a host of books around that ensured that I wanted to sort of absorb, um, but it was sort of just, causing a lot of stress. And yeah, I started to look online, and I came across an interview with Toni Morrison. And she, in that interview, talked about the language not sweating in regards to how she sort of acknowledges good work. And that really impacted me. And also, it's Toni Morrison's birthday today. So happy birthday to Toni Morrison. But that really impacted me. And I wanted to create an image that sort of talked about the production of knowledge, the osmosis of these sort of works around race, gender, sexuality, and so forth. How it could sort of be both overwhelming and potent. And in the midst of that research, I started to sort of continue to think about Black men in our psychological landscape and how it can be impacted, how it could be carved out, um, and disentangled from a lot of the psychic wounds that had sort of historically impacted us. And I discovered that the closer you live to blue space, which is bodies of water, the better you're off mentally. And that sort of set me on this journey to create these different series of works that are blue spaces, and sort of the question that I had for myself was, how could Black men generate their own blue space? And I will share a work that was a result of that question. Uh, And so that work was entitled To Bathe the Mirror. It is a 5-channel video installation composed of various screens across a space that go every which way. There's projections pointing on the floor, there's projections on the ceiling, there's projections that are varied in size and scale. And a lot of that was a sort of result of this research around blue space and the blues and this question of how do Black men generate their own blue space. And for me, it was sweat, and sweat being sort of uh, this evidence of an interiority rising from beneath the flesh. That became a sort of reoccurring motif in the work, which brought me to my most recent body of photography, which is entitled Notes Towards Becoming a Spill. And I'll share my screen again. So these are some of the images that appear in the article by Antwaun. And Notes Towards Becoming the Spill, I began in 2019 in Jacksonville, Florida. And essentially it is picturing Black men within the setting of a Black frame, sort of undergoing this sort of ritual-like constitutive process of becoming through these sort of like meditative images. The idea was to again think about this concept of visualizing a boundless Black masculinity, and by emphasizing that sweat as a sort of way to point towards a sort of new plasticity of Blackness or queerness, and just thinking about the spill in itself as a way of pointing towards a sort of anti-form, a form that cannot be contained, a form that cannot be policed, and thinking about Black men in general and how we sort of navigate, Black queer men in general, how we navigate space or sort of lead ourselves into constructing spaces for ourselves that that are in effect these sort of dwellings of freedom that I mentioned before with the earlier work. And so we'll probably talk more about it later on, but I'll close there and throw it over to Naima.
Thank you for that presentation. Shikeith, we haven't met before, but we have so many intersections. I was born in Philly and have a lot of family in North Philly. But I was raised in New York, and New York is a site where a lot of my work takes place. And when I think about what Utopia is and looks like, it is community. And I'm going to start with a project that I began in 2018 that was then untitled. I didn't know quite what it would become, but it is Pursuit. And Pursuit is a deck of playing cards. It is an object. It is a book. It is a game. And really, it's a celebration of queer women, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, and thinking about the communities that help us become ourselves. So within the deck, there are individuals, there are couples, and there are collectives. And when we started making this project, so this was my kind of first serious move into studio portraiture. I usually work natural light, outside, daylight, but really was thinking about how can I construct a space that welcomes people, that feels safe, that encourages people to come and show up however they feel comfortable and however they want to represent themselves at that moment. So the deck is very small. It's 2.5 by 3.5 inches, your standard poker deck. And at my exhibition right now called Brief and Drenching, which is one of the last lines, taken from one of the last lines of Zami, one of Audre Lorde's books. There are a select number of portraits are on display at Fotografiska that are about 39.5 inches by 27 inches. So thinking about the scale of the work, what does it mean to walk into a gallery space and be confronted by these images and have to look at these images and to think more about the individual people and all of what they adorn themselves and how they want to present and share who they are. And when I'm thinking about portraiture, especially for pursuit, it's really important to think and talk about the language of the project as something that is very fluid, that is not fixed, that is not a portrait that I'm hoping will represent someone for the rest of their lives, but that it's a portrait that represents this brief interaction that we had, this brief encounter, but also a sustained community that is grounded in this work. In 2020, I have been thinking about how to bring the project forward, and that is through creating an archive. So right now I'm working on building an experimental archive that will come out. The prototype will come out next month, and it's called Skin Contact. And so in Skin Contact, you'll find interviews with couples who are also business partners. There are different contributions that take the form of poetry and reflections from people who sat for the project. And then I was able to photograph, while I was a session artist at Recess in Brooklyn, I was scheduled to photograph about 90 people for the second iteration of Pursuit. So thinking about card suits also as earth elements, as seasons, as thinking about the cyclical nature, and also wanting to reflect that in the set design. So the first set is lighter, there are more mauves and mesh and kind of sheer fabrics. And so the second set is more autumnal, and there are velvets and dried leaves and russets and mustards and things like that. And so unfortunately, because of the world that we are living in right now, only 10 people are able to sit for the project. This is Kenya and Alexandra, and this is On. So this is really what I've been spending a lot of time in recently, thinking about this world, but my work is really about and really exists in the unstaged moments, the lived every day. This is a portrait from a birthday party where the toilet paper, or not the toilet paper, the paper towel just started floating away. And so when I think about this, Shikeith also mentioned this a lot, thinking about those blues and thinking about the boundlessness, but also the spilling out feels really important to me right now, to be able to exist outside of and around traditional or normative ways of being, and really thinking about the ways that we create our experiences, the ways that we create our homes, our communities. So water is also a very central element to my work. And Reese Beach has been a really important site for me for the last 5 or 6 years. When I think about what the actual physical site of this beach is, it represents not only community, but really thinking about transformation, thinking about overflow, thinking about intimacy and abundance, and also my position as both someone who is in and of the community, but also someone who is documenting the way that I have to move in and out of these moments. So again, this was not a staged moment. Athil wanted to build a fort and people started helping her. And again, so this was a commission for activation residency, which is thinking about trans futures. And it's a residency where you are invited to come up for a couple of days and just rest. And that is the only requirement, that you rest, that you take time to care for yourself. All your meals are prepared. And so they invited me up to make some portraits of the residents and just the day. And so I spent a lot of time walking around the grounds and thinking about moments where we are encouraged to take time for leisure and rest and play is very important, but also crucial. So this is in the style of the portrait that was in Utopia, which was Diamond at Broward Park in Crown Heights. And that portrait of Diamond where she's kind of sitting with her eyes closed, really just letting the sun beat down on her face. That was a new way of thinking about this series, Jewels from the Hinterland, where so many of the portraits are about confronting the viewer, confronting ideas that Black people can't exist within lush, green, urban environments as spaces of leisure and rest. And this moment right here, Michelle Lisa, was a moment that was a glitch. And I think about this moment as something that's a real anchor for me right now. I wasn't intending to make a double exposure, but how this photograph does the work of so many of my other ideas, and thinking about the layering of green space within the Black body, and also, again, the water in the background. This was made in Miami. And this is Jay in Oakland. So thinking about Utopia as ever growing, as clarity, as fresh air, as sites of safety. This is a series called Attraction Experiment, which was made between 2017 and 2018, where I was feeling tired of basically being in control of the shutter and of the camera. And so I invited people who had sat for me in the past, and people that I'd maybe met in one-off occasions, but felt some pull and attraction towards them, to make portraits of the two of us. And so to participate, they would present me with instructions and I would perform whatever they asked me to do. So that went from feeding someone a banh mi sandwich to getting my hair wrapped, to being tied with rope, to reading someone a book. It was a whole range of ideas, but the idea was, for me, it was the time where I was feeling really disconnected and really, really numb. And so turning to my practice, which often really cares for me and rejuvenates me, and to think about the people who I have spent a lot of time with, making portraits with, and inviting them back to do something with the two of us, where I was no longer in charge of the shutter and no one was in charge of the shutter. And so creating some sense of a more neutral environment. And when I think about Utopia, it is the ability to be fluid. This is a portrait of Misa, who is one of the alter egos of E. Jane, who is an artist and performer. And being able to create not only the environments that we want to be in, but the people we want to be at any given moment. Spaces of rest, deep rest, like what does that mean? What does that look like for me? That's something that I struggle with. And so in thinking about how to create and really enjoy time and moments of leisure and rest, and to not always have to look back or confront the camera or the viewer. And to allow ourselves to be multiple. And I'm gonna end there.
Thank you both for your presentations. You know, I'm going to sort of ask some questions. We're going to sort of engage in a conversation. But if there are questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. One of the things that I sort of am in this sort of essay was sort of really interested in, and sort of also knowing both of you for as long as I've known you and sort of followed your photo careers and your careers as artists, is just sort of the way that you sort of occupy sort of two different, very different communities, right? And so I was thinking about this sort of idea of like community as utopia, and I was wondering if you can sort of speak to how that sort of shows up in your photographic practices.
I can jump in. I feel like I wouldn't have a photographic practice without community. And so I'm so interested and so invested in photographing the people around me, whether that be, you know, I've my best friends who I've photographed for the last 10, 15 years, but also people who I'm just interested in learning more about. I think my practice is really one of curiosity, where I'm interested in people, I'm interested in observation, I'm interested in connecting with people. And so I think that without the figure and without portraits and without people, I wouldn't be energized to make the work in the same way.
Yeah, it's the same for me. A lot of the people that I photograph, photograph repeatedly. You know, there's this sort of ongoing evolution of picturing these individuals, and again, sort of getting to know them through this process of making photographs. And the people that I do photograph, not everyone is someone known to me. Sometimes they are initially strangers who I will meet through placing ads on like Craigslist or using dating apps. But when I think about queerness in general and where we seek out community, the virtual is a huge part of that. You know, growing up in AOL chat rooms and, you know, MySpace, and that was how I sought out community. And I've taken that, and it's been a fruitful way of how I'm generating these images today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what sort of interesting about sort of the communal in your work is that there seems to be sort of this real emphasis on sort of documentation over representation. And I was wondering if we can sort of tease out some of the differences between sort of documentation. I know Naima speaks about sort of these moments of sort of almost afterthought moments, these small moments that sort of you remember or you sort of capture, sort of say in a lover's sort of, you know, like a lover sort of picks something up and you sort of love to sort of, you know, the flow of, you know, his or her body or their body. And, you know, you kind of cherish that, right? And so you try to sort of seek to sort of image that. I think about that in sort of in Shikeith's latest, you know, photographic series, where he's sort of there's this sort of psychological sort of element happening in these images where he's capturing these sort of moments of ecstasy, right? That are sort of revealed sort of in the expression, but they're all sort of happening, in the mind. And so I was wondering if you could sort of kind of talk about the ways in which you're using documentation as a device to sort of think through depiction.
You want to go? You to go. Okay. Well, for me, it's when I'm photographing someone, or making photographs rather. I'm always trying to document something that isn't as tangible, isn't as present, that something that a camera can capture. So, unlike Naima, like my works are highly staged, and in that staging, there is this sort of moment that happens, that I'm sort of setting the playground for, right? And there's these moments that are withheld from me, as the photographer. So it's what's happening, and something that's happening internally, and that's what I'm trying to sort of get at through picturing these men with their eyes closed and them sweating. I'm trying to get at documenting some sort of fleeting moment that occurs internally that you won't see in the actual photograph, but it'll sort of lead your imagination to thinking about or painting a picture of.
And I think also allowing for moments of self-recognition. I think what's been really interesting about making Pursuit, and what I don't think I mentioned, is that I think about 65% of the people that sat for that were, I was meeting for the first time that day when they were coming to set. And there are a few instances where I remember, someone said to me, when I first saw this portrait, I hated how sad I looked, but then was able to reflect back months later and say, well, actually that was the time that I was in. And it's okay that you saw that time, and that time might live somewhere for a long time. But I think archiving feels so critical to me, because so often when looking through materials, it's like you have to dig so hard to find anything that can resemble my experience. And so oftentimes I'm looking at the historical, or I'm thinking about documents or things that I see or stumble upon, and think about, okay, but what does that look like right now? What does it look like if it's not just white people? Like, what does it look like for Black people to occupy green space in a way that is full of joy and pleasure? What does it mean that when I told people about that work in 2014, that they asked me that their first kind of visual reference was one of slavery, and they said, oh, how will these images, like counter images of slavery? And I was like, how is that your only reference for a Black person in green space? So I think it's about thinking expansively, but also just being able to picture what I know is true and real, and what I know is happening all around me for people that I will never see, and for people that I do see and interact with, and wanting to introduce more ways of talking about and thinking about more visual language around Black life and queer life.
I sort of think of that as sort of a utopic impulse, in the sense that there's this sort of moment where you're like, how is there this like disconnect between 400 years ago, right, a visual history of 400 years ago, and today, and how do you sort of bridge that gap, with a camera, right? And some of that requires sort of a future dreaming, right, or sort of a dreaming or of these, of Black figures in certain spaces, right, and sort of in a sort of idea of a counter narrative, right? Naima brought up this idea of the archive, right, as sort of as having a potential for Utopia, right? I know that Shikeith collects a lot of images, found images, vernacular images of different sort of queer couples, or what he's sort of dreaming into those photographs as sort of acts of queerness. And I was wondering if Shikeith wanted to add anything around sort of this idea of the archive containing sort of, potentiality, sort of a way to sort of read yourself into history. And I just wonder if you wanted to sort of talk about that, because I know that this is a part of your practice that not a lot of people sort of know about, but it's something that is sort of, you're actively sort of creating this sort of personal archive to sort of think about what is possible.
Yeah. So I collect images of Black men in thrift shops, vintage shops, eBay, and these images are historical, contemporary, and of other past. And I'm sort of just looking for evidence of a Black queer past. And through these images and bringing these images together to sort of do what Saidiya Hartman talks about, is the sort of critical fabulating.
Mm-hmm.
Building new stories or sort of excavating these stories through these images, because the archive is a sort of unstable place in itself, and I'm sort of mining that instability, like Naima talked about earlier, this sort of unfixed, this boundlessness, and sort of stretching those out through sort of recontextualizing these images with new images or juxtaposed with one another. And it's been a sort of like outside of just me working with the camera, but working with these images. I'm sort of creating photo albums. I don't know if you can see right there. I have a photograph that I picked up, and it's just, I don't know these men, but there's like I live with it, like they're like my family, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of having them around me to sort of imagine, these sort of queer ancestors. And it's been a sort of a very cathartic part of my process of art making.
It really, sort of the way that you guys are sort of talking about the archive and the potential of the archive really sort of brings me to this sort of thing that Jose, or this line that Jose Munoz sort of opens with in Cruising Utopia, where he says, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer, right? And so it is about sort of an imagining, a sort of longing, or sort of always becoming, if you guys are sort of talking about, which I think is so sort of critical to sort of queer identity, right? I think about sort of growing up and not having any sort of models for what that looked like, and having to sort of piece together from TV to film to art to what have you, books, to sort of piece together to sort of idealized version of like where I should be moving in my identity, or what sort of kind of, or how I should be performing my identity, right? And so I think that it's like it's just such a sort of huge part of queerness and of becoming, right? I'm gonna ask one more question because we have 7 here, and I want to make sure that we get through a few of them. Space is such a vital part of how you think about photography, right? And how, I mean, really a picture really frame is really just, you filling space, right? And sort of, and I was wondering if you think, sort of thinking about both your practices and thinking about sort of the ways that like you are thinking about space in the photograph, and sort of the potential of that space for sort of the production of future space, right? And so I was wondering if you can sort of talk about, Shikeith, you often sort of, you have this beautiful monumental installation up right now in Cleveland. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about the ways in which you utilize space in that exhibition, which is on view right now. And also, Naima, if you can talk about the ways in which you're thinking about space, particularly, I'm just so fascinated by the ways in which you're sort of thinking about green space and thinking about sort of access and sort of care in those spaces. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
It's actually really exciting because I talk a lot about blue space
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
which is just waters of bodies of water, if you don't know. And so to hear Naima talk about green space, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, And so because there is these really specific histories of Black people tied to both spaces, green and blue, that are both fraud and, but then also they are sites of cultivation. Thinking about the swamps, and those being it's sites or passageways towards freedom. Thinking about the blue light basement party where you saw Black people going underground into these sort of seek out a sort of liberation that they couldn't see above ground. That happens in the same way with queer culture, and sort of the underground or the down below being sort of a place where we sort of are seeing ourselves. And so I'm looking at a lot of that, or sort of trying to create a language around that, both within not only the photography, but also the installation, the sculpture, the film, and how it sort of constructs space by my usage of these materials that point towards a sort of lowliness, I say. So the water, the glass, and I think of them in terms of Blackness and queerness because water and soil and all these sort of organic materials, these are materials that avoid stasis. They can exist in multiple forms, and whether it's a solid or liquid. And it's something really special about that multiplicity and working with that multiplicity as an artist who identifies as queer and Black, to say this is sort of an abstract representation of me or of my identity. But I would love to hear what Naeem has to say about how she constructs space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the green and the blue, the ocean, the water, and also the trees and the plants are so interdependent and connected. And when I first started making Jewels from the Hinterland in 2012, it kind of started as my love letter to New York in a way, where I grew up here, but there are so many places I haven't seen, and so I wanted to think about mapping different green spaces and also being very flexible with what that space looked like and what that space was. So maybe it's a site that we're all familiar with, like Central Park, but then maybe it's also a median, like down by a South Street seaport, right? Like near the bridge. And so it can be a site that you might not ever think to spend time in. But that place is there, that environment, that habitat is still growing, is still cultivating life in a lot of ways. And so thinking about kind of what's able to break through, and also what is designated green space, and also who has access to it structurally, like who can get there, who lives next to a park, why or why not, and thinking about the history of New York City, and thinking about the ways that Black people and Black communities have been cut through in so many ways and been removed from green space, or even thinking about blue space that is often polluted, and so really asking questions about why is it that kind of these prevailing ideas of Black people in cities still look like images from the 1960s, and why can't we think about contemporarily Black life in cities as lush, as growing, as fertile, as safe, as including all of that into the narrative.
Hmm. We're going to take a few questions from the audience who have, thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate you guys in sort of this endless Zoom economy that we're living through, for spending the an hour with us. I really appreciate it. The first question, we'll take a question for Shikeith, and then we'll take a question for Naima. For Shikeith, can you talk a little bit about the experience of working between still photography and moving image with your video installation? This is from Aaron Burns.
Yeah, I mean, I started to work with the camera in high school, and so I have a long relationship with working between both moving and still images, and expressing myself. And I mean, the difference between when I'm creating sort of spaces, video installations where with moving images, I'm sort of interested in depicting the sort of choreographies of Black masculinity, and how we sort of perform within and around them. And in doing that, I'm sort of picturing largely a lot of dance, Black social dance in particular. And it's just sort of again sort of just trying to point towards sort of a form that is sort of evoking a boundlessness, or sort of plasticity or liquidity. And though I sort of get at that both with the still and the moving image, I think the moving image has been sort of a sort of pathway for me to sort of like emphasize it even further.
Mhm. And this is for Naima, from Dominique Lewis. I've been reading and thinking a lot about the Harlem Renaissance lately, and I'm wondering if Naima was thinking about Carl van Vector's studio portraiture from that time period. How has his aesthetic as an outsider ends up dominating our visual record of Black queer life in that time period? How do we reclaim the form of studio portraiture from within the community? Is it a form you think you'll return to? So the first question, part of the question is, are you thinking about Carl van Vechteren? I imagine no is the answer. And then the second question is, how do we imagine the form of studio portraiture from within the community? Is it from you? Is it a form you think you'll return to?
So the Carl van Vechten story name is funny because I haven't thought about him since I took a Harlem Renaissance literature class in college with Monica Miller. I am not actively thinking about him, although I know I have some of his books. But I also think about, in thinking about studio portraiture, it's something that I felt so disconnected from for a long time because I wasn't interested in artificial light. I wasn't interested in the idea of staging, I think. And then but I think there was just a fear of not knowing exactly what to do, or not knowing how to use all the equipment, or not just being like, you know what, the sun might be tricky and move a lot, but I know how to work with that light source. And to have a source that's actually fixed and very easy to manipulate, it really like completely opened up the way I think about making images, the way that I use lights, the way that I think about set designing too, because then when you are able to have a studio or a home for your work, or a home for the actual set, then that creates, as someone who's very interested in space, but also interested in inviting people into space. So Recess was supposed to be a community space with a reading room, and for people to come in and just lay and read, and there's lots of soft seating and lots of places for you just to exist. Like, you didn't have to do anything in that space. And I was only able to have it open to the public, I think, for 3 days or something like that. But the idea of studio portraiture is definitely something that I will continue returning to. I mean, I work with, now I feel like I am lugging lights around everywhere. So it's interesting how my practice has shifted in that way, and also the way that I'm interested in creating studio spaces that can remain fixed, so that so many different types of people can come in and kind of make their mark on the environment, and think about the way that the studio and the way that the set changes with every sitter and with the energy that's brought in with different people. So I am really interested in thinking about those the ways that different people activate the studio.
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to add about the Van Vechten sort of conversation. It's, like, I think that, like, in this moment where we have so many, young photographers, not just queer photographers, but photographers, Black photographers sort of working, I think it's a work against a history where you think about, Van Vechten and not think about sort of other photographers who have been working in Harlem, Black photographers, Vanderzee, namely, among others, and so I think that, like, opposed to sort of thinking about Van Vechten, I think we're working actively against him. I think that, like, that sort of history sort of belies a violence. If you really sort of read about sort of how those images were made, right? And I think that, like, it's just important to sort of say that, right? That and especially when you're sort of thinking about photographers who really sort of think about communal links and really think about sort of care in their sort of photo practice, I think that, like, it's really important that we think about not just sort of the sort of resulting image, but how those images are made when we're thinking about sort of who photographers are thinking about, or or what legacies we're willing to sort of carry on, right? I just wanted to sort of say that, but there are a few other questions. We're not going to get to all of them, unfortunately. For Shikeith, can you talk about, because this is something you didn't touch on, which I think is really sort of interesting, especially in relationship to sort of ideas around sort of futurity and utopia, is sort of the idea of the religious imagery in your work. A question perhaps is there a place for religious spiritual practices in Utopia? If so, how might it be reflected in art? Good question.
That's a great question. I, in particular, grew up in a household that would be considered Christian. But the way that my family did religion or the spiritual wasn't one of connected to the church.
Mhm.
It was a different kind of rhythm that we held in our houses, where sort of how we structured our own spirituality, it differed greatly, and I consider that a sort of a queering of those sort of like sort of hegemonic structures that are built within certain religions. And I do that often with the sort of architecture of spirituality, or spiritual architecture in my installations, or sort of referencing older sort of Christian paintings, and the sort of compositions of those, but then also acts that happen within the Black church, like baptism, but then outside of the Black church, like exorcism and these sort of other things, and so I'm sort of weaving in and out between, or sort of to sort of create a sort of oscillation between these sort of ideas of the sacred, and yeah.
The question that we'll sort of do two more questions. One, I think this would be a good one for Naima to answer. Thinking about the Watermelon Woman and how that film served as an alarm clock to the lack of archival material. How do you imagine your work will serve the future of Black queer artists and creatives?
I think it's my hope that, when I made Pursuit, I was thinking a lot about Catherine Opie's Dyke Deck, which she made in 1995. And I hope that, in 20 years, there is some other extension of the way that queerness exists in the future, and that it will be so vastly different from the way that I may have pictured queerness from 2018 until whenever I end the Pursuit project. But yeah, I think with both of our works, it's about creating more openings and creating more exposing gaps and holes, but also creating more safe places for people to see themselves and to feel like they can exist in that world, and to feel like they want to create something not even similar, but like sparked by something in the way that we visualize the worlds that we're excited about. So I think that all of the work, even like when I see Shikeith's work, I'm like, oh, like I'm so interested in the way that you make and the things that you share. And so looking at peers too, there are so many photographers who are friends who I'm inspired by. There are so many, I think there are so many ways to think about lineage. And I really do love that it feels like there are a lot of us in conversation with each other, even if we've never been in the same physical space, that there is still a sense of support and encouragement, and there's some sense of kinship, and not with everyone, and that's not going to exist with everyone, but I do think that there is a special moment happening, and that will be extended and that will exist in the future, and there will be so many other queer Black photographers and image makers and artists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what is so important is that there is a tradition, right? There is a history. There is a sort of, as much as sort of there's this sort of assumption that, you know, we're working against sort of a history of lack, there is a richness there, right? And I think that I often also think about, sort of as a sort of writer, think about how one of my sort of preoccupations really is about how does the work sort of speak to sort of, you know, cultural moments. How do they sort of work speaks to each other, right? What are the dialogues, or what are the differences, right? And are those differences, you know, useful in sort of exploring some of the sort of issues or concerns within the community, because I think that could also be a very generative process. The last sort of question I want to leave you both with, which is one of my favorite questions that's asked, is why did you both choose the medium of photography as a means for creative expression? Why photo is the question, and I always love that question because I think it's one of those questions that really grounds sort of the practice in some ways.
Well, for me, it's connected to my family history. My grandmother, she was a photographer, and I don't think that she would call herself or name herself a photographer, but I grew up around photographs hung very similar in her home, and every visit she pulled out the camera. I have photographs of me as like a 3-year-old holding like her Kodak film, and you know, and so I've always sort of been around that mode of expression, and so it was sort of, you know, a sort of natural progression for me to sort of, as a child, I was always really artistic, but it was sort of a natural progression for me to sort of pick up a camera and go to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually kind of have somewhat of a similar story. I feel like I come from a long line of artists who weren't allowed to be artists, and recently found out, maybe 4 years ago or so, on my dad's side, that someone was a photographer, and my little brother found a bag of film that had survived a house fire, that had survived a lot of conditions, and I think it was probably filmed from the 70s, and so we had it processed, and we had about like 80 images that my dad had never seen from his childhood, and he's not sure who made the images, but it's more evidence that there is a lineage of photography also in my family, and I grew up around and always encouraged to make and took my first photo class at Harlem School of the Arts, where we made pinhole cameras out of cardboard boxes. And I remember just thinking about, holy shit, like my world just exploded to be able to see myself, but also to use this material that is material that we just throw away, that we discard, that we think about as a cheap material. And so I think when I'm making images and when I'm making objects, I'm so interested in like the mundane and thinking about the kind of highbrow, lowbrow disconnect and how those things can really exist and be bridged so seamlessly a lot of the time.
Thank you both so much for sharing your work and for with the Aperture community, and for the interviews that you gave me to sort of inform the piece. And as friends and someone who's in conversation with you guys, I just wanted to say thank you again for your time. I want to thank the Aperture community and for joining us tonight for a really rich and insightful conversation. I will turn it over to Nicole to see if she has anything else to say, but I really appreciate you guys sharing.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to all three of you for what was truly a brilliant conversation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I highly recommend that everyone who is watching sees Shikeith and Naima's work and Antwaun's words in print. So there's in the chat box, you can find the discount code. I highly recommend you pick up an issue of Utopia. Thank you so much to everyone.
Have a good night.